Go ahead and get started. If others join, wonderful. I'm Lynn Coolidge, Head of Growth for Literacy. So thank you so much for registering and taking the time to join. Excited to have you. And we will send you a recording of this webinar. So Jamie, I know you messaged that you might have to hop early, not a problem. We'll follow up with an email with the recording for you. So before we get started, if you could let us know, Jamie, where you're from and what your role is, and then Dennis, if you want to do the same, that would be great.
Sure.
Sure, yeah. My name is Jamie Higgins. I'm based in Raleigh, and I'm a dyslexia therapist, and I also support literacy with benchmark education.
Oh my goodness, that's wonderful. Well, I recognized your name, and it might be from Benchmark. Um, However, who knows? We'll figure it out. There's like 6 degrees of separation between everyone, right?
That's right.
So
That's right. Yep,
yeah.
exactly. We all cross in the same circle. So thanks for hosting this today.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about you, Dennis? Where are you from and what's your role?
I'm a graduate professor of education for NYIT, and I basically design and teach the student teaching seminar and the literacy-based courses for the program.
Oh, excellent. That's great. I'm so glad to have you. And I know Bo Ryan. How about that, Bo? Thank you for joining.
So excited to be here.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Bo, we were just doing quick introductions because we don't have many who have joined. And we've got Jamie from Raleigh, and we've got Dennis from, I think you said New York, right,
Uh,
Dennis? Yeah.
Definitely.
And Bo, do you want to just do a quick shout out where you're from and what your role is?
Bo Ryan, hi all, principal here at Anna Grace in Connecticut, and an author, and loving what Miss Colich has been doing, and I'm excited to be here.
That's so great. I'm glad to have you, all of you. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and jump in. Um, as I mentioned before you join, Bo, you'll get a recording of this. And in addition, you can mute yourselves, but there's going to be an opportunity for at least certainly one of you to come off mute. And please use the chat. If you've got questions, type them in. I have a great colleague here with me from MGT. Her name's Jessica, and she'll keep an eye on the chat should I unintentionally ignore it. And because we have so few of you, I'll certainly answer any questions that you may have at the end, but I'll also pause throughout to address any questions and honestly feel free to come off mute. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about a hot topic today, scaffolding with grade level text. And so here's sort of our agenda. I like to start with what I call science of reading shout outs, right? As I travel throughout the country and meet with a lot of different educators, actually, even internationally, I hear a lot of chatter. And so I want to talk about what are educators talking about specifically in terms of literacy. And then we want to dive into this whole hot topic of grade level text and what scaffolding really is and how it should look like in your classrooms and how you can leverage fluency instruction to do that. And then I have only 2 slides at the very end if you're interested in learning a little bit about MGT and what we do, especially in terms of science of reading. So I've got 4 questions here to think about as we go through this session today. I apologize. Let me back up just a moment and just give you a 30-second view, quick snapshot of who I am. I'm head of growth for literacy for MGT. I have been now 10 years working in sort of the ed tech, ed business side of things, but I was a university professor, literacy coach, director of curriculum, all those things. And my favorite thing in the whole world to do is honestly teach first grade. But that's a little bit of my background. I taught all of the quote science of reading courses at the State Department at in the state of Ohio at higher ed institutions, all those courses that educators need to take in order to be reading endorsed. But here are the 4 questions to think about. One, Why is it essential to use grade level texts during reading instruction as opposed to text at students' instructional level? What does effective scaffolding look like in practice? And what actually is reading fluency, and how does it impact or influence reading comprehension? And then the final question to think about is, how can fluency instruction be implemented to support reading growth and reading comprehension for all learners? So hopefully by the time we're done today, you'll have some thoughts about each of those questions. So as I mentioned, as I travel throughout the country, I hear a lot of educators talking about a lot of things, but on the next slide, you're going to see those things that I hear them talking about as they pertain to literacy. And I'm just going to rattle these off. Equity, MTSS, phonics, joy, stamina, dyslexia, 3Qing, adolescent readers, content knowledge, universal screening, foundational skills, language comprehension, structured literacy, leveled readers, simple view, morphology, grade level text, scaffolding, Scarborough's rope, third grade retention, multilingual learners, gap closing, and professional development. Now, in all honesty, I could probably, include multiple slides with all sorts of additional topics, but these were the ones that I chose. And so what I think we really need to be talking about is fluency, and not just fluency assessments, but fluency instruction. So my goal today is to make that case and to provide you with some evidence-based practices. So I would love if I could get one of you to come off mute and read for us out loud this very short paragraph that you're going to see here on your screen. And I promise you it's in English. That's all I'll promise, though. So do I have a volunteer willing to do that for us? Jamie. Yes, Jamie, thank you. I'll go ahead and click this through, and then when you're ready, we will find out if you are a fluent reader. All right.
Okay, sounds great. Awful Henry's it basket rotten pinched. As he they grabbed Washington would Henry knows. From smell to ask these, a pawpaw his surprise smell like. It the smell and George, why they, Caitlin K. Strader.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, I did not whip out my cell phone and calculate Jamie's reading rate, but imagine if she were a second or third grader and I sat her down to do an oral reading fluency assessment and I had 27 students in my classroom. Would I be concerned about Jamie? Chances are no, right? I think we can all agree. I watched the text closely. I don't think she had any miscues, so she decoded 100% accurately. Her automaticity was excellent. She wasn't struggling to decode, sound out any words. And I would also add that she read with pretty good expression. She nailed those exclamation points, etc. So, Jamie, you're not done quite yet. What did you learn? What did Henry grab?
No clue.
Why was Henry surprised? And what would George Washington think?
I remember the author's name was Catherine Strader or something along those
Yes,
lines.
Caitlin Stewart.
Yeah.
It's actually my daughter. She is the author of a children's book. And so I pulled this text from one of her pages. So point being, we just got done, or I just got done mentioning that I wouldn't be concerned about Jamie, right? If I was sitting down and calculating her reading rate, etc., I would check her off the list. However, if I took the time to ask comprehension questions, it's very clear that she really didn't comprehend what she was reading. And this is the case for many students, but oftentimes we assume that if they decode automatically or fairly accurately, then we can check them off the list. So what I want to do is provide a really more detailed explanation of fluency, perhaps more than you may have thought. Now, I happen to know Bo a little bit. I'm an author of a book as well, which I'll talk about, and I know Bo has a copy of the book and has read it. So fluent readers really make their message understood. One, whether they're reading silently to themselves or if they're reading out loud to listeners, to an audience. And what's important is that fluent readers read in phrases, they respect patterns, in syntax. They're really communicating with that listener. And although pace has to be adequate, it's not about how fast students read. Unfortunately, we often unintentionally, or I would argue sometimes intentionally, have communicated to students that it's all about how fast you can read. And that's just not the case. In fact, actually processing the meaning while we're reading and paying attention to phrases, the syntax, intonation, those are actually more indicators of reading fluency and reading comprehension. So, how do we ensure that students become fluent readers? Well, it takes explicit instruction. If you think about it, we have to explicitly teach some vocabulary. We have to explicitly teach phonics if we want students to orthographically map letters and sounds. Well, if we want them to be fluent, we actually have to explicitly teach it. So I don't know if you're familiar with the verbal efficiency theory, but this is a theory from Perfetti and Lesgol from 1979. I was actually 9 years old when this came out. And what they said is that mere word recognition accuracy isn't sufficient to enable fluent reading comprehension. And instead, word coding skills has to be increased to a high level of efficiency and automaticity in order for the student or the reader to be able to devote attention to meaning and to comprehension. And fluent reading actually involves decoding automatically, accurately, and with prosody. And what I've done is create this CAP visual, and this is what I like to use when I work with educators. I call the verbal efficiency theory the CAP theory. It's about comprehending in real time, not just at the end of the text. It's about decoding accurately and automatically, as well as reading with prosody. So this is this acronym I like to use to explain this. So I want to kind of press pause and talk about 4 different reasons why educators, I think, are talking about all of these topics like gap closing and complex text, etc. So we're going to quickly do a dive into NAEP data, the NCTQ study, a statement from AirDef, and the TNTP study. So first up, NAEP data. We've likely all seen it, right? What I like to do is look at data in comparison from 2019, just on the cusp of COVID, to 2024. And if we look at 4th grade reading scores, 39 states or jurisdictions saw decreases. And I like to highlight my personal state of Ohio. You can certainly find your own state here. And then what is notable is that 12 states saw no change, and it was only Louisiana that showed improvement. 8th grade scores were pretty much the same. 38 states jurisdictions saw decreases from 2019 to 2024, including my home state. 14 states saw no change, and not a single state showed improvement. And again, this is NAEP data, not individual state proficiency data. Here's some additional data. 31% of 4th graders nationally can read at or above the NAEP proficiency level. That's it. 80% of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch are not reading at or above proficient level. And nationwide, we currently know that 10 to 15% of students won't graduate. And of that group of students, 75% will report difficulties learning to read. So, it stands to reason if we can work on closing that reading gap, we can simultaneously address the graduation rate. So your state, like mine, may have introduced something like 3rd grade reading guarantees. So meaning, you have to implement high quality instructional materials, and 3rd grade students have to get a proficient score on the state summative test, or they can be retained, right? So that's pretty much been, general response. Why is that? Well, because we know that reading fluency is significantly associated with reading proficiency or that comprehension score. In fact, 20 to 70% of variance in comprehension can be explained by fluency in grades 1 through 9. So fluency is a pretty big deal, and I would argue we don't talk enough about it. Here's a study. It's a synthesis of research from 2001 to 2014. And what Walker, Stevens, and Vaughn found is that fluency interventions not only improved reading fluency, but actual reading comprehension scores. And this is for students at the elementary level with learning disabilities. So there is a researcher, Richard Allington, from 1983. I actually included his work in my doctoral dissertation. And he claimed that fluency is the neglected reading goal. And he says that fluency in oral reading is often noted as a characteristic of poor readers, but we seldom treat it, right? Immediately we want to talk about explicit phonics instruction, absolutely, 100%, but we also need explicit fluency instruction. And the question I often ask is, how many of you assess for oral reading fluency, or your educators do, in your school or your district? And pretty much I get nods from across the room when I'm presenting. And the question then is, why do we assess what we don't teach? So you think about that, right? We're certainly teaching phonics, teaching students to map letters and sounds, and we're assessing it to determine how well they can do that. And we're oftentimes, even up to the middle school grades, as a literacy coach, I had to assess oral reading fluency 3 times a year for 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. But we rarely teach it. So this is something that we need to change. If we look at the Scarborough's reading rope, right, we've got language comprehension strands and word recognition strands. Pretty much everyone in education literacy is familiar with this. But what I want to note, and what is often not explained, is that space where those strands come together, that is actually fluency taking place. And those strands don't come together on their own. That's where explicit instruction comes into play. So 75 to 90% of 3rd and 4th grade students nationwide who don't get a proficient score on some of those high stakes tests like state proficiencies, they have gaps in accurate word recognition, automatic word recognition, and or prosodic reading. And there's your fluency summed up right there. And we know that just because we teach students to map letters to their sounds, that does not automatically ensure that they're going to become fluent readers. We've got to explicitly teach that. Here's another theory, and I don't know if either of you, Dennis, Jamie, or Bo, if you're familiar with the active view of reading. This came onto the scene in 2021 by Duke and Cartwright. And what they noticed is they accepted the simple view of reading, and for what it is, it's, quote, simple. And they noted that there are actually additional constructs. There's more to it than just the language comprehension strands and the word decoding strand. And they noted that active self-regulation needs to take place, right? Where, students are using metacognition, they're self-regulating, all of those things. But what I want to draw your attention to, if you're unaware, is this middle section, the the bridging processes. And within the bridging processes, there we find reading fluency, along with things like morphological awareness or graphophonological semantic, drawing a blank on, let me look closely, graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility. That's it. Yeah. So herein lies fluency. And in 2023, Duke Cartwright and Matthew Burns from University of Florida published a study where they looked at reading interventions, and what they found, you'll notice these effect sizes in this graphic, is that when teachers intervened within the bridging processes, things like fluency, those interventions had the greatest effect size or impact on reading comprehension, more so than intervening in the word recognition area, language comprehension, or active self-regulation construct. So pretty interesting. So let's take a look at the National Council for Teacher Quality Study. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but you definitely want to Google this and leverage this. Take a look at this site and then toggle to your state. So what you're looking at is a bar graph. The orange or gold rods there represent the blue represent national percentages. And I brought up Ohio in the yellow. What they did is they looked at higher ed institutions throughout the country and in each state, and they evaluated how well they prepare pre-service teachers to teach the 5 foundational skills of literacy. And you can see those along the bar graph there: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And they rated these institutions with an A or a B in terms of, how well they're preparing those pre-service teachers. So notice fluency. 51% of the institutions nationwide earned an A or a B. In Ohio, it's only 46%. So I do encourage you to take a look at your state institutions and see where they're at. Because I think this is really helpful information, and it sheds a lot of light on where we need to ensure that our pre-service teachers are better equipped to teach constructs like fluency. All right, I want to talk a little bit about a quote, and this is from the executive director, Rebecca Cochler of AirDeaf. And here's the quote: "In K3, students learn to read, and after that, they read to learn." So I'm not going to ask you to put anything in chat or come off mute, but I want you to think about this. Is this a true or false statement? So I agree with AirDeaf as well as other thought leaders. This is false. And oftentimes we hear legislators make this kind of comment that, oh, in K3, that's when kids learn to read, so that then can take those skills and read to learn. But actually, that's not true. And she actually says, this is Cochler in a K-12 Dive article, she said that assessment data, as well as results from interventions with explicit instruction on advanced decoding skills, such as multisyllabic word recognition and morphology knowledge, showed that many older readers continue to need explicit instruction in advanced decoding skills because learning to read doesn't end in 3rd grade. And so I like to use really this seesaw or teeter-totter analogy, right? Like those adolescent readers still need this kind of teeter-totter or ebb and flow of decoding skill instruction, particularly around morphology, multisyllabic words, just as much as they need to read and build content knowledge deep and wide. So if you hear state legislators, stating that whole kind of axiom, about learning to read in K3, it's important to note that that's not actually accurate. And we need to pay attention because adolescent readers and the fact that, if we look at their 8th grade NAEP scores, they need a lot of assistance, right? All right, the last thing we're going to look at is the new teacher project study. And this one's been around for a while, so about 6 years now. In 2018, they released a study called the Opportunity Myth. And what they noted, they observed students in classrooms, and they noted that those students were meeting class expectations 71% of the time. So, okay, one would assume, all right, not bad, right? About 3/4 of the time. They flipped that on its head and they actually compared class expectations to state standards or grade level expectations. And what they found is those same students were only meeting grade level expectations 17% of the time. And so they named this study the Opportunity Myth because what they said is, we oftentimes as educators will tell students, if you work hard, you get good grades, you can go on and achieve your dreams, whether that's college, military, etc. But what they're finding is that's not often the case. Students aren't prepared for that next level because often unintentionally we have lowered the rigor bar, and we can't continue to do that. All right, so if we're going to talk about opportunity, we need to talk about equity. And equity never means lowering expectations. However, oftentimes that's what we do unintentionally. And in order to build equity into our classrooms, we need high quality materials, high expectations. And this is where we need rock star instruction, right? High quality instruction delivered by high quality prepared teachers. And, the goals and expectations need to be the same for all the students. What changes are the supports, AKA scaffolds, for each student. So if we're going to talk about opportunity as well as equity, enter in this notion of the complex text. And why is complex text important? So, if I were to imagine that all of you here are, let's say, fourth grade students. However, Dennis is reading at a second grade level, Jamie's reading at a first grade level, and Bo's at a third grade level. So therefore, I only provide reading instruction, or at least the majority of the time for reading instruction is spent using text below grade level at your instructional level. How will you learn new vocabulary? You won't, especially if you're reading text below grade level where you likely were introduced to those words already. How will you ever have the opportunity to roll up your sleeves and actually engage in and decode complex syntax? You won't. And how are you going to build new content knowledge if what you're reading about is content knowledge below grade level? So this is really why complex text, grade level texts are important. And this is why it's not an equitable practice to be providing instruction with text below grade level. So I don't know. I know Jamie had to hop. I don't know if Bo or Dennis, either of you have read or are currently reading Tim Shanahan's new book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives. So I finished it. And if you follow me, and I think, Bo, you probably do, I know I follow you on LinkedIn. If you don't follow me yet, Dennis, please do. The last couple weeks, I've been posting kind of a synopsis 3 days a week of each chapter and some important points from Shanahan. And in his book, this is a quote that I love. He says, the point shouldn't be to place students in books easy enough to ensure good reading, but to provide enough scaffolding to allow them to read harder books successfully. So let's talk about scaffolding. When we think about scaffolding, the first thing that should come to our minds is using grade level text. And so when we think scaffolding, right, here's the visual, something like this that probably comes to your mind. Scaffolds are supports. They're not just about exposure, right? It's not just about reading aloud to students, although that is an evidence-based practice, but that's not enough. Not all scaffolds are alike. Some need much more, some need less. And assessments have to determine the types of scaffolds because Dennis might need support with developing vocabulary, Bo might need support decoding certain morphemes, etc., right? And then finally, scaffolds have to be temporary. What tends to be the case is that they are often there and remaining after the structure is built, and that shouldn't be the case. So, when do we scaffold? Well, research suggests that we should scaffold beyond the beginning level, and Shanahan even mentions this because we've got to make sure students can decode at least 80% of the words in a text, that fluency is the goal, and that they can master the most common graphemes and morphemes. If students haven't learned to orthographically map yet, then that's where we need to start, right? And so here's a quote again from Shanahan. He says, make sure that students have solid foundational skills in decoding, at least through a high first grade or a beginning second grade level, before you increase text complexity to teach reading. So that's important. And Dr. Heidi Mesmer also has shared the same statement. So when you're thinking about providing scaffolds, you want to think to yourself, first off, what lived experiences and assets can the teacher and student leverage, right? What supports are already in place? Are they multilingual learners? Do they already know how to decode in their heritage language? And if that's the case, we don't need to teach them how to read in English. We need to work on understanding the English language, but not necessarily on how to read, right? That makes a difference. So what supports are currently in place right now? What are you currently providing in Tier 1? Are they receiving Tier 2 supports or interventions, Tier 3? How many words can the student read accurately? And is the student spending the majority of time just listening to others read to them? Because if they are, that cannot be their only access to complex grade level text. That will not suffice. So think about equity versus equality, right? Not all scaffolds will look the same for every student. So how do we scaffold? All right. So research suggests choral reading, echo reading, partner reading, repeated reading of the same text, and the fluency development lesson, which I will here very shortly get into. And so as I travel throughout the country, I'm going to put a cough drop in. I often hear educators say, yes, but. And I don't know, Bo, or if Dennis, you hear this, but what if grade level isn't the student's level, right? Are you telling me that, I have a student who's reading at a 400 Lexile, but our grade level text is 600? I really think I just need to work with them in a text at the 400 Lexile. Instead, I think we change the question. What if grade level isn't the student's level yet, right? It's our job to get them to that 600 Lexile. And the way that we go about doing that is fluency. That is your scaffold. 3 additional pieces of data here on really kind of refuting this notion that, striving or quote struggling readers can't access grade level text. Notice the following bullet point there. This is from Shanahan's recent book. He talks specifically about adolescents, multilingual learners, and what he says is that those schools who are teaching with grade level text, not text matched to students' instructional levels, are seeing the greatest gains in their students. So not only can it be done, it should be done. All right. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions, comments, thoughts about what I've shared so far?
I just wanted to say I can't seem to write in the chat box.
Oh, okay.
So I've written some stuff in the Q&A, but
Oh, that's fine. Let me take a look here in the Q&A. And I have the swirling circle here. Okay. Okay, yes, I do a lot of work with Tim Rosinski. In fact, I'm going to show you the book that he and I had published a couple years ago. I have seen a strong focus in grades 1 through 3 for a greater balance for reading to learn as a component. Yep, absolutely. There is a huge focus there, and for good reason, right? This is where we should be teaching students all of those components of the reading rope. This is where we should be teaching students to become fluent readers. But some of that instruction can't stop just because they're past third grade. Yep, okay. Yeah, Doug Fisher, excuse me, as well. Very familiar with his work. So, and thanks, Dennis, for typing in those questions and comments. How do we stop these rumors? In other words, how do we close these gaps so we don't have to keep talking about it? So my main mantra is assessments don't close reading gaps. Now, there's a caveat. Do we need assessments? Absolutely, because I would argue we really can't even begin to instruct until we have that assessment data that tells us what are students' strengths and areas for opportunity. But those alone will not close gaps. So I'm constantly encouraging state departments of education to not just focus on, universal screeners and benchmarking, but looking at what instruction is taking place and providing educators with professional development. So I would argue that we need a mindset shift here. We need some behaviors to change. Instead of just asking, how are you assessing fluency, right? Or what are your students' oral reading fluency scores? I think we need to ask, one, how are you teaching fluency? Might be great to ask your university students, what do you think fluency instruction should look like? And how are students, or how should students actually practice fluency? So I want to talk about explicit fluency instruction. So believe it or not, I was doing a webinar and I asked educators, and this was a webinar for New York educators. This was in the fall, and I think it was it was a webinar for New York City. And I asked them, what does explicit fluency instruction look like? And someone actually said, oh, it's pre-teaching vocabulary. And, you know, it was interesting, the additional answers. No one really provided a specific example of what it should look like or sound like. Thoughts. So, Dennis, when you're working with university students, what are some things that you might be talking to them about in terms of fluency instruction? Or Bo, what does it look like, where you're at?
It all starts with repeated reading, right?
Repeated reading
And
is absolutely an evidence-based practice.
you covered so many of the good ones, the choral reading and the echo reading and the paired reading. And
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, Bo, did you want to add anything? And you certainly didn't have to.
Yeah, just the book for Mr. Dennis and Miss Jessica changed our school. We're a middle school. We have a high percentage of kids coming in at need. I found the book, studied it, and we wanted to create it for middle school and not just use readers theater. We wanted to use repeated reading with our kids. So we created a plan. I reached out to Mr. Rosinski, who got back to me, which was amazing, and it's made such an impact in our school. It's a fantastic resource for all schools.
Yeah, you absolutely have really done an incredible job. And so, Dennis, I'm going to dive into what exactly this practice is that Bo's doing at his school. So when you teach reading fluency, Dennis, you mentioned repeated reading. Absolutely. Here are a list of evidence-based practices. And, I always call out that teaching fluency takes time. It may not even be 15 minutes. It could be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but we explicitly teach phonics. Therefore, we should explicitly teach fluency. And here are a list of those evidence-based practices. Modeling, right, with interactive read alouds, choral and echo reading, phrase reading, partner reading, repeated reading. And what I'm going to share with you today is the Fluency Development Lesson. So in 2000, I actually discovered the Fluency Development Lesson. It was cited in the National Reading Panel report. And the authors, the researchers talked about the fact that fluency is a critical component of skilled reading. Nevertheless, it is often neglected in classroom instruction, and they went a step further. What they did was they cited a research study with the Fluency Development Lesson by Rosinski, Paddock, Linick, and Sturtevant. Now, what I did is I took it and I expanded it into a 5-day unit. And so I'm going to give you an indication of what that looks like. And this is just a screenshot of different research studies done with the Fluency Development Lesson. The top one here is from my doctoral work. I worked with Korean children. They were refugee children. They were learning English. And I worked with them for a year and a half, and I implemented the Fluency Development Lesson. So when it came time and I decided to work on my doctorate, I knew that I wanted to use this fluency development lesson because I'd had great success with it in my classrooms. So I'm going to give you an overview. The Fluency Development Lesson, or FDL, is about listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So all literacy, not just reading, and it's with grade level text. It incorporates those evidence-based practices like echo, choral, phrase, repeated and partner reading, readers theater, poetry parties. But it's not just about improving fluency. It also embeds all of the 5 foundational reading skills. And you can implement this, as Bo mentioned, in grades K-12, even in kindergarten, with short little decodable texts. And it's great for multilingual learners. It can be implemented as core reading instruction in Tier 2 and Tier 3. And so when I was doing my doctoral research, I created the Fluency Development Lesson and SIOP model crosswalk. And we know that multilingual learners really are superheroes, right? They've got their heritage language to leverage. And so I really feel like the Fluency Development Lesson is this crosswalk to the SIOP model. And the SIOP model is sheltered in intervention observation protocol model for multilingual learners. So I actually used a poem. Here's an example that I worked with or used when I worked with the Corinne children. And I picked a lot of poems from Shel Silverstein, only those that were appropriate, because they were often learning personal hygiene. They didn't, they bathed in rivers. They didn't know what soap was or shampoo, even toilet paper, right? And so I chose this poem about the mummy. And here was a writing activity that then I embedded. And these were all students learning English who had some literacy skills in their native language. And so what I'm going to do is actually walk you through what some of the fluency development lessons look like. And Dennis, this is just a screenshot of the book that Bo was mentioning. So it's the Fluency Development Lesson, Closing the Reading Gap, with my co-authors, Dr. Tim Rosinski and David L. Harrison, who is a former poet laureate for the state of Missouri. This book contains, I think it's about 28 units, and a unit is 5 days worth of activities, and it's for grades 1 through 5. We actually created 50. We will hear from Benchmark Education this summer what they're going to do with the other 22 units. So if they'll publish a second edition or not. So we're waiting to find out. But I want to walk you through what this looks like. Here is a poem from the book. Now, we've created poems for grades 1 through 5. You can use any text. We happen to love poetry, but I'm going to show you that you can implement the Fluency Development Lesson with math problems. So this particular poem is called Not Yet. And so on day 1, the teacher reads the new poem, reads it multiple times because that's an evidence-based practice, right? Modeling fluent reading. You're going to discuss the poet's purpose and style because comprehension's the goal. You're going to pre-teach vocabulary, and you're going to go to your high-quality instructional material, your scope and sequence for your reading curriculum, and you're going to look at what particular skills are you working on. Are you working on alliteration or onomatopoeias or identifying rhymes, right? The Fluency Development Lesson is an add-on, but it's not meant to be willy-nilly. It should be implemented purposefully and aligned with what your scope and sequence is, what you're currently teaching with students. You'll notice all the scaffolds built in. On Monday, students aren't asked to read the poem at all by themselves. You wrap up that quick lesson with a choral read or echoing the teacher. So here's an example of a word in the poem, marmoset. You might need to pre-teach that, especially if you have multilingual learners. Here's another word from the poem that you might need to pre-teach, clarinet. Day 2, Tuesday, teacher rereads the poem and you actually teach your students. I'm a big proponent of this. Tell them what automaticity means and accuracy and prosody. If you're teaching them what a fluent reader sounds like, you need to teach them the components of fluent reading. Students will chorally read the poem. You're going to divide them up into small groups, have them read different lines, different stanzas, have fun with it, and go back to your core curriculum. If you're working on digraphs or consonant clusters or antonyms, you are going to do word work with that text, with that poem aligned to your scope and sequence. Here's the poem. I've divided it up into stanzas. The shortest stanza is the last one. I might quarterly read that out loud, right? You switch it up and you have fun with it. You give students an opportunity to read for different purposes and different audiences. Here's a writing activity. This one has to do with riddles. So you might do a language experience approach and have your students work together to create another riddle like the one in the poem. Wednesday, same poem. Teacher and students quarterly reread. You teach them how to partner read with purpose, right? You teach them how to provide feedback on accuracy, automaticity, and prosody. You ask for volunteers to read the poem. And then on Wednesdays, Tim created a word ladder for each of the poems. So Dennis, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Rosinski, but he is infamous for his word ladders, and we've embedded word ladders into each unit.
Yeah,
It gives
Tim
students.
wrote the introduction to my Reader's Theater study that I did on using Reader's Theater to improve fluency and comprehension.
Excellent. That's great. Yeah. Thursday, day 4, same poem. Students quarterly read, they self-evaluate. You can tape record your students reading from Monday all the way to Friday and play back recordings and have them notice the growth that they've made. You get volunteers to read for class, or students will want to volunteer. And then students take that text or that poem and they read it at home for families, and never let that be a roadblock. If they don't have anyone who will listen to them, they can read to a pet, a rock, a stuffed animal, to themselves in a mirror, right? Doesn't matter. And because reading and writing are synergistic, we have students complete a writing activity. And here's an example of a writing activity embedded into that lesson. Friday, last day, every single student, whether they're a multilingual learner, whether they have an IEP, they're receiving title services, they are able to read that poem by themselves or that text. So you want to have fun. You want to bring joy back into the reading experience. Have them read with different emotions. Have students perform for different school audiences. It's as simple as having the custodian come into your room and listen to them read the poem. And then you can record things like mystery readers. I used to do that all the time. And I'd have students, I'd record students, I'd play it back and see if the class could guess who the readers were. You can record, other adults, parents reading, etc. There's a lot of opportunity to have fun with it. Then Monday, you start with a new text or a new poem. But what's important to note is this is not just about the ELA classroom. My son is a middle school, he's an 8th grade math teacher, and I've shown him how to take 8th grade math story problems and spend the last 2 minutes of class doing a choral read or an echo read or a partner read with math story problems. And what I want to show you is, I love that Bo talked about the progress his students have made. I had an educator in Maryland, Howard County Schools, reach out to me and to Tim. And she works with 1st through 5th graders as the literacy intervention teacher. She works with her students for 20 minutes a day. She decided to do nothing but implement the Fluency Development Lesson, and she started sharing data with us. And there's a lot of data up here. She's got Dibble scores and May's comprehension scores for 5 of her students. And what's notable is that in 5 weeks' time, her students, the average increase was 45 words correct per minute for those students just in 5 weeks. And not only did their rate, their automaticity improve, but their accuracy as well as comprehension scores. I have to just quickly share this really great anecdote. She started working with a music teacher at the elementary school, and he created sheet music for the poems, and the students would go to music class and actually sing the poems, and she was sending me recordings. So it was pretty awesome, right? Whole school really involved in this whole notion of reading fluency. And so finally, we'll wrap up here. If you're not familiar with MGT, we've been around for 50 years. and we actually support science of reading work. And so I sit on the academic transformation team, and we work with school districts, whether they're, K-12 public, charter, you name it. We work at the university level as well. And we support all things academic transformation. We'll do needs assessments and strategic review to help agencies, schools better understand, hey, you've got some gaps and here's where I think where they are and why. We do school and district transformation, really customized, built for each client customer that we work with. We actually will do curriculum development and implementation. If schools are implementing really great reading or CKLA, we'll come in and walk side by side with them and help them through the whole implementation process, making sure they're implementing effectively and with fidelity. And we actually will just do science of reading implementation. We do coaching and modeling, think kind of boots on the ground. We are in schools, in classrooms, working side by side, not only with educators, with literacy coaches and school and district leaders to provide support on, everything from what is science of reading, but now, and most importantly, how do you take what you know and actually turn it into a game plan? How do you implement these evidence-based practices? So, there's science of reading. If there's a QR code, and you can certainly take a screen more about our academic transformation work. That QR code will take you to our site. You can certainly Google it. And I did put up on the screen just a snapshot of some data from Ohio, where we went in and we worked with a district, 3 elementary schools, and we went in and helped them with their science of reading implementation. And you can see that the average percent proficient or above increased significantly from one year to the next. So all of our implementation specialists are exceptionally trained, CIRI trained, which is aligned with the International Dyslexia Association. So, we stand by the support that we provide. So with that, we've got 5 minutes. One, I want to thank you so much. And 2, I'll open it up for any questions you may have or comments, and we'll be sure to get this PowerPoint to you as well.
You have a lot to bring to the table there. That's for sure.
Well, thank you. Yes, and Dennis, are you, which courses in particular are you teaching?
The predominant thing I do is I design and teach the student teaching seminar, and I do that, but I also teach theory of reading and dealing with reading difficulties and integration of reading in content areas, all those courses.
Excellent.
Matter of fact, I coordinated the New York State Reading Conference a bunch of years ago, and that was our theme, literacy in all curriculum areas. And of course,
yes,
keynote speaker was Tim Shanahan, of course.
Of course, yes, absolutely. I've absolutely loved. I've done quite a bit of work in New York, and have been invited to come to quite a few of the BOCES to do full day workshops on, literacy, content area instruction. What does that look like? I absolutely love heading to New York, and have New York City has had a couple on-site within the last 2 years conferences. They're on Saturdays. They invite parents in. So I've presented sessions there as well. But yeah, really love supporting New York. Yeah, and Bo, because you're in Connecticut, I know the Connecticut State Department of Education is looking at revamping sort of, they're looking at revising their audit system in terms of ensuring that all of the courses and all of the resources that are at those higher institutions, the 18 throughout the state, are actually, aligned to science of reading and with dyslexia instructional requirements, all of those things. So Connecticut is engaged right now in looking to do that. And MGT is hoping to be able to help them, but we don't know yet. So, yeah.
Sounds good. Personally, it was a shame that there weren't more people that could attend this because you got a lot of good things to bring to the table.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, that's all right. I'm thrilled that you were able to attend, and this is our first Science of Reading webinar launch, because oftentimes educators don't realize that MGT does Science of Reading work. And so we will have many more. We're hoping to do, I think, at least one a quarter, so maybe 4 a year. So hopefully we'll gain a little traction and have a lot more signed up next time. And I will very likely bring in someone next time. Usually that's what I like to do. I've done webinars with Tim Rosinski. I've done them with Natalie Wexler, if you're familiar with her work. So next time I'll bring in a heavyweight. So.
Well, you're pretty heavy in that area on yourself.
Oh, well, thank you. Very
Thank
kind.
you.
And, thank you, Bo. All right. Appreciate you both. Thanks for all the work you do, and take care.